I wasn't standing in that driveway when it happened. I only know it because my mother screamed most of it at me over the phone 90 minutes later. And because Colonel Sturgis, when I finally worked up the nerve to ask him directly, told me the rest in the same flat voice he uses for everything. But I've replayed it so many times since that I can see it now better than things I actually witnessed myself. So this is how it went. The staff car was already turning onto the gravel when Gwen Halstead, 2 houses down, stopped watering her porch plants and just stood there with the hose running into the grass, forgotten, soaking a patch of impatience that didn't need it. Across the road, Denny Ostrander cut his mower engine mid-pass, and the sudden silence seemed to travel down the whole street like something physical. Nobody in Cass Hollow, Missouri, needed to be told what it meant when a man in service dress blues stepped out of a government sedan, straightened his jacket at the shoulders, and walked up a gravel drive like he had somewhere specific to be. Wanda Bellamy opened her front door with her hand already halfway to her mouth. I know exactly how her face must have looked in that moment, because I have seen that face 100 times on the families of the men and women I fly home, the particular collapse that starts behind the eyes before it ever reaches the mouth. Colonel August Sturgis did not make her wait for it. He is not a man who lets people sit in fear longer than necessary, even people he has never met and owes nothing to. "Ma'am, nobody has died," he said, which was 11 words, and probably the kindest thing he said all week. Dry as he generally is, because he understood precisely what that uniform does to a woman standing alone in her own doorway on a Tuesday afternoon. Then he held out a cream-colored envelope, heavier stock than a standard letter, with a wing crest embossed into the flap. "This is an invitation," he said. "Your daughter, Senior Master Sergeant Marguerite Bellamy, is being recognized this year for 12 consecutive years of distinguished performance in aeromedical evacuation. The ceremony is in 6 weeks, at the base in southern Illinois. I drove out personally to deliver it because I wanted to be certain this year that it actually reached you." He didn't explain why this year was different from the previous 11. He didn't have to. He got back in the sedan, pulled a slow 3-point turn on the narrow street, and was gone before Gwen Halstead had even turned her hose off. 90 minutes later, 400 miles away, my phone rang at the tail end of a 12-hour shift, while I still smelled like jet fuel and antiseptic and the particular recycled cold of the inside of a C-17 at 31,000 feet. I was sitting on the tailgate of my truck in the squadron parking. Boots still on, flight suit unzipped to the waist, and I saw my mother's name light up the screen and felt that small, stupid lift in my chest that 12 years of practice hadn't managed to train all the way out of me. Some part of me is always 11 years old when that name appears. What came through the phone was not congratulations. "Do you have any idea what you did to me?" Wanda said, before I'd even gotten a full syllable of my name out. Her voice had the particular vibration it gets when she's been rehearsing a sentence in her head for the better part of an hour, refining it, sharpening the edges. "A soldier, at my door, in his dress uniform, in the middle of the afternoon." Gwen saw the whole thing from her yard, hose running, and she had Patty Ostrander on the phone before that car had even cleared the driveway. "Half this street spent 20 minutes believing you were dead. Marguerite." I had to stand on my own front porch, in front of my own neighbors, and explain that my daughter was in fact alive. Do you understand what that does to a woman? I sat there on the tailgate and listened to my own mother be furious at me for not having died. "It's an award, Mom," I said, keeping voice level, the same voice I use when I'm telling a frightened 19-year-old with a shrapnel wound that the descent is going to hurt, but it means we're almost home. 12 years running now. Colonel Sturgis said he drove it out himself, because he wanted to make sure you actually got it this time. I thought, maybe this year you'd come. I have things that weekend. She didn't ask what things. Neither did I. That was the first question answered, and it landed the way it always lands, which is to say it barely landed at all anymore, because I had built calluses over that particular spot years ago. I asked her the second question anyway, the one I had constructed and dismantled in my head roughly 400 times across in 12 years, turned over in the dark on deployment, rehearsed and unrehearsed, and never once actually let out of my own mouth. "Can I bring Dad?" There was a pause just long enough that I could hear, underneath it, the refrigerator humming in her kitchen 400 miles away, and somewhere further back, the tick of the hallway clock that had hung in that house since before I was born. Your father doesn't know who you are anymore, she said. I want to explain, carefully, why that sentence did what it did to me. Because on paper it should not have been the sentence that broke something loose. I have worked medical evacuation for 12 years. I have sat beside burned hands and shattered femurs and men who did not yet have names because nobody had finished identifying the remains. I have heard family members say some version of that exact sentence to me over video calls in hospital corridors at 3 in the morning. In the flat, worn, smooth voice people use once again, grief has carved a groove so deep the words come out without any friction left in them at all. I know precisely what that sentence sounds like when it is true. It did not sound like that. It sounded rehearsed. It sounded like something practiced in a bathroom mirror before a phone call, the exact cadence a person uses to tell a customer their order is out of stock and there is nothing further to discuss. You could at least sound grateful someone thought to recognize you, she added, before I could respond to what she'd just told me. 12 years of ceremonies and I have had to hear about every single one secondhand. From Gwen, from the newspaper clipping your squadron mails out. It's embarrassing, Marguerite. People ask me about your career like I'm supposed to have details, and I have nothing to tell them. I've invited you every year, Mom. You've mailed me a program every year. That's not the same as making time for your family. I didn't answer that because there was no version of the truth in that sentence I could agree with, and no version of a fight about it that was going to get me any closer to my father. Okay, I said, because in that moment I genuinely did not know what else there was to say to it, and I hung up, and I sat on that tailgate for another 4 minutes doing the thing I actually do for a living. Underneath all the other things, which is to look at a reading on a monitor and decide, calmly, without letting emotion touch the instrument, whether what's in front of you is real, or whether the equipment itself is lying to you. Here is the actual dilemma I was sitting with that night, the one nobody else on this earth could answer for me. My mother had just told me my own father no longer recognized his daughter, and every single instinct built into me over a decade of watching families manage the truth about sick and dying relatives was screaming, quietly but insistently, that I was being managed too. Do I trust the woman who raised me? The woman who, as always for 12 years, had a reason ready the moment I asked a question about him? Or do I get in my truck this weekend, no list, no invitation, no permission from anyone, and go find out for myself what's actually true? Would you go? Comment Y if yes. Comment N if no. I'll tell you the truth by the end. I want to explain what my actual life looked like before that phone call, because none of what came after makes sense without it. Aeromedical evacuation is not a glamorous job. Most people picture the moment a patient gets carried up the ramp. But the job is really the 11 hours after that. Checking a chest tube every 90 seconds at altitude, because cabin pressure changes what a wound does, recalibrating a drip because the plane just dropped 4,000 feet to avoid weather, talking a 19-year-old through the worst pain of his life in a voice steady enough that he believes you when you tell him the descent means he's almost home. I am good at that job. I have been good at it for 12 years, in 3 different theaters, and I have never once lost a patient in transit. That is not a boast. It is the only fact about myself I have ever fully trusted, because it is the only part of my life nobody in my family has ever managed to argue me out of. My sister Charlotte, older than me by 5 years, runs the administrative side of a clinic 2 towns over from Cass Hollow, manages patient files, manages schedules, manages the version of events that gets written down. My brother Rudy, younger than both of us, sells farm equipment and has spent his whole adult life declining to notice things. I grew up believing the 3 of us simply orbited our mother at different distances. It had never once occurred to me, before that march, that the distances themselves might have been engineered. Colonel Sturgis did not apologize for driving 4 hours round trip to hand-deliver an envelope. And when I asked him about it 2 days later, standing at parade rest in front of his desk, he looked at me the way you'd look at someone who'd apologized for filing paperwork correctly. I keep records, Sergeant Bellamy, he said, without looking up from the folder in front of him. 12 consecutive years of an empty family seat at this dinner is not an oversight, it is a pattern. I do not like unexplained patterns in my own wing, and I have had time to notice this one. He closed the folder and set his coffee mug precisely on the coaster to its right, the way a man measures things for a living. An invitation that arrives by mail is a request. An invitation delivered by a commander, in person, is a fact. I wanted your mother to receive a fact this year instead of a request she could set aside. Then he asked me 3 questions, flat, in the exact tone he'd used running a pre-flight checklist. Is your father living? Yes, sir. Where does he reside? A care facility. Ridgeline Manor, in Cass Hollow, Missouri. When did you last see him? I opened my mouth to answer and nothing useful came out because the number that surfaced in my head was wrong. Not wrong, in the sense that I didn't know the figure. Wrong in the sense that when I actually counted it out loud, in front of a man who had built a career noticing patterns, it did not match the story I had been quietly telling myself for 12 straight years. I had driven to that facility 31 separate times. I had seen my father in that same span exactly twice. Sturgis watched me perform that arithmetic and didn't rush to fill the silence, which was its own particular kind of mercy from a man who wasted very little on mercy. I explained it to him anyway, because I needed to hear the explanation out loud and see how it sounded when it left me, rather than when it lived only in my head. My mother had told me, years back, that Dad's vascular condition made him agitated whenever I visited, that his doctor had recommended limiting stimulation for his own sake, that it was kinder to leave whatever I'd brought at the front desk and let her manage his good days on her own terms. I am a medical professional. It was a medically plausible thing to be told. It came from my mother, who I had no reason on earth to distrust. So I signed a guest book, handed a paper bag to whoever was working the front desk, and drove 400 miles back to base feeling, every single time, like I had just done something loving. I want to be fair to him, because he deserves it. Colonel August Sturgis is not a man anyone in the squadron describes as warm. He has run our wing for 6 years with the exact same even, unbothered tone, whether he's approving leave requests or grounding an aircraft over a maintenance discrepancy nobody else caught. He keeps a laminated card in his top desk drawer listing every airman under his command by name, hometown, and next of kin. And he updates it himself, by hand, every quarter, because he says a computer file doesn't make you actually look at the names. I had served under him for 4 years, and never once had a personal conversation with him that lasted longer than 90 seconds. That he had spent an entire afternoon driving to Cass Hollow and back, on his own initiative, for a family seat at an awards dinner, was so far outside his known behavior that half the squadron had a theory about it by the time I got back from his office, none of them correct. Fergus picked his cover-up off the desk, which meant this conversation in his mind was concluding. Sergeant, I have written 11 casualty notifications to families in my career, he said. 11 doors, 11 times delivering the worst possible news a family can receive. Nobody, not once, ever answered that door angry that their son or daughter was alive. He settled the cap under his arm. The dinner is in 6 weeks. I don't intend to involve myself in this further. This is your family, not my wing, and I have made my one gesture. But you should probably go find out, in person, exactly what you have been signing your name to for 12 years. Cass Hollow is the kind of town where I did not need directions to Ridgeline Manor. I had made that drive 31 times. I knew which pothole on County Road 9 rattled the glove box open on its own. I knew the receptionist's coffee mug said "World's Okayest Grandma" in faded lettering. I knew the exact two-tone chime the automatic doors made when they let a visitor through. And I knew, without thinking about it, which hallway smelled faintly of the lavender hand lotion the aides used on Tuesdays. I did not call ahead this time. That in itself was new. The receptionist typed my father's name into her terminal, looked at the screen, and did something I had never once seen happen across 31 visits. She stopped typing and looked up at me instead of at the monitor. "Let me get Miss Kell," she said, already reaching for the phone on her desk. Sandra Kell ran Ridgeline Manor the way some people run air traffic control. Competently, without a wasted motion, and entirely without warmth. She did not apologize for what she was about to tell me because in her framework of the world, there was nothing in it that required an apology. "Mr. Bellamy is no longer a resident here," she said, folding her hands on the counter between us. "He transferred out in July of last year. 8 months. My father had been living somewhere else entirely for 8 months, and I had continued driving 400 miles, on 4 separate occasions, to sign a guest book on behalf of a man who was no longer in the building I was signing it in. Where did he transfer to? I'm not able to disclose that information. I'm his daughter. You are not listed on his authorized contact roster, Ms. Bellamy. I understand that's difficult to hear, and I am sorry for the difficulty, but I am not sorry for the policy. I can't confirm his current placement, his medical status, or, frankly, whether he is living or deceased. That authority belongs entirely to his guardian and conservator. Her office smelled like the same lavender hand lotion I'd noticed in the hallway years ago, and there was a small dish of butterscotch candies on the corner of her desk that I'm fairly sure had been there, untouched, since my first visit. She wasn't unkind about any of it. She offered me water. She offered, twice, to have someone walk me back out to my truck, as though I might need steadying, and I realized only later that she'd likely delivered this exact conversation to other families before mine, in the exact same measured tone, and that the tone itself was probably the most humane thing she had left to give people in my position. Is there anyone here who might remember him fondly enough to just talk to me, off the record? I asked. I couldn't authorize that, and I wouldn't ask my staff to put their jobs at risk for a conversation that isn't mine to permit, she said. I'm sorry. I mean that. I want to be precise here because it matters to everything that came after. Sandra Kell was not lying to me. She was not protecting a conspiracy. She was doing her job exactly the way state law required her to do it, calmly, correctly, by the book, and that was the first moment the entire shape of what had happened to my family became visible to me. Not as some tangled family misunderstanding, but as a structure. A structure built entirely out of paperwork, procedure, and authority correctly delegated, in which every single person acting exactly as they were supposed to act could still leave a 71-year-old man completely unreachable by his own daughter. Could I at least see the current guest book? Just to confirm my last recorded visit. The current book is here at the desk. The archived logs are in storage off-site. You would need a court order to access those. I walked past the front desk on my way out anyway and looked down at the open book. Today's date at the top of a fresh page, an empty line waiting for whichever visitor came in next, and a printed column running down the margin that I had signed past 31 times without ever once actually reading its header. Resident notified of visit, it said in small block capitals. Every single box in that column, as far back as the current volume went, sat blank. I stood there long enough that the receptionist finally looked up from her screen, uncertain whether to say something, and in that small hesitation I understood that she, too, had probably signed off on that empty column 100 times, without ever once wondering what it meant, because nobody had ever given her a reason to wonder. That, more than anything Sandra Kell had said to me in her office, was the detail I carried out to my truck that afternoon. Not malice, just an entire system built well enough that nobody inside it ever had to notice what it was actually doing. It took 2 full days of phone calls, every licensed facility within a 100-mile radius, working from a list I built myself off the county health department's website, before someone at a place called Wickham House confirmed, almost by accident, that yes, they did have a resident named Merle Bellamy, and no, ma'am, we don't typically release that kind of information over the phone. But you're already 3 questions deep into knowing his exact date of birth, so I suppose there's not much use pretending otherwise now. Wickham House was smaller than Ridgeline, older, sitting 40 miles further out past 2 towns that barely qualified as towns, the kind of facility with a single-window air conditioning unit rattling in the day room and exactly 1 aide covering 11 residents on a Tuesday afternoon shift. Nobody stopped me at the front desk. Nobody checked a roster against my name. The building simply didn't have the staffing to notice one more visitor walking through. I found him by a window, in a vinyl recliner, under a blanket that wasn't his. I knew immediately it wasn't his, because my father's blanket, the one my grandmother had knitted for him the winter before she died, carried a small burn mark near one corner, from a wood stove incident back in 1994 that had become a permanent joke between the two of us, and this blanket, thin and hospital-issue blue, had none of that history in it at all. He looked up. It took him a second. I watched him work at it, watched something behind his eyes go searching, and then land. Maggie, he said. Not Marguerite. My mother has called me Marguerite my entire adult life, in the particular tone of a woman correcting a mispronunciation. My father had called me Maggie since I was 6 years old. standing on a stepladder handing him electrical tape while he worked, and he said it now like the word had never once left his mouth in the intervening years. We sat together a long while. He lost the thread twice, asked me once whether I'd finished my paper route yet, asked me once whether it had rained on the 4th of July, but in between those two lapses, he was entirely achingly present, nowhere close to the fog my mother had spent over a decade describing to me in careful, sympathetic detail. At one point, he reached over and turned my hand palm up, the way he used to do when I was small, and he wanted to check whether I'd been biting my nails, and he ran his thumb once across the calluses at the base of my fingers, the ones I've built from 12 years of gear straps and equipment cases. Working hands, he said approvingly, like I was still 9 years old and had just learned to hold a hammer correctly. Your mother always said you had soft hands. I told her she'd never actually looked. He turned my hand over once more, thumb tracing the same line, unhurried, the way a man checks a splice he already trusts but wants to look at anyway. I thought about the summer I was 11, standing on a stepladder in a thunderstorm that hadn't quite arrived yet, holding a roll of electrical tape while he worked on a transformer box 2 houses down from ours, because the co-op was short-staffed that week, and he'd brought me along rather than leave me home alone. He'd told me that day that a lineman's whole job was making sure people never had to think about where their light came from. That the best version of the work was invisible, and that was the whole point of it. Bad. I hadn't thought about that conversation in 20 years, and it arrived in that day room with the force of something dropped from a height. Then he asked me, with no accusation in it at all, only a kind of tired confusion that hurt worse than anger would have, "Why don't you ever come see me anymore?" "Dad, I've come 31 times. He looked at me the way you look at someone who has just told you something kind but structurally impossible. A gift you can't quite accept because you've already built your whole understanding of the world around its absence. They told me you were busy," he said gently, like he was protecting me from feeling bad about it even now. "Overseas a lot. They said you'd ask them not to call you at the facility so it wouldn't be hard on you, knowing I was declining and you couldn't get here in time to help." He folded his hands in his lap. "I asked every single year on my birthday. I always asked whether you'd called that day. What did they tell you?" "No," he said, "every year. No." He said it so plainly, so free of self-pity, that it took me a moment to feel the full weight of it land. Then he added something I hadn't asked for, looking back out the window at the parking lot instead of at me. "I used to tell myself you'd write. I don't read as well as I used to. Letters get away from me, but I thought maybe you'd sent something and it got lost in the shuffle here." I asked about that too. They said there wasn't any mail for me. Not once in 12 years. He turned back to me, and for a moment his eyes were entirely clear, entirely present, and entirely his own. "I want you to know I never once believed you'd forgotten me on purpose, Maggie. I just couldn't figure out what had happened to you instead." "Nothing happened to me, Dad. I was right here the whole time. I know that now," he said. "I didn't know it an hour ago." I walked out to my truck and sat behind the wheel with the key in my hand and did not cry because crying was not going to be useful to either one of us in that particular moment. I took the small notebook I carry for flight manifests out of my bag and wrote the date at the top of a blank page. Because 30 seconds earlier this had stopped being a private family misunderstanding and had become something with a shape, a timeline, and a paper trail, and I intended to build one of my own to match it. Rosalind Pike's office sat above a hardware store 2 counties over, and it cost me $60 in gas, and 4 hours in a waiting room that smelled permanently of burnt coffee to get 50 minutes of her actual time. She did not perform sympathy for me. I liked her for that within about 90 seconds. "Here is exactly what you've walked into," she said, sliding a case file across her desk that somehow already had my father's name typed neatly on the tab. 4 years ago, a Missouri probate court granted your mother full guardianship of the person and conservatorship of the estate for Merle Bellamy. It was uncontested. There was a physician's capacity affidavit attached, which the court accepted at face value, the way courts generally do when nobody in the room objects. A guardian's authority over a ward's visitors is broad, Miss Bellamy. Broad enough that everything that has happened to you so far is, on its face, entirely legal. An adult child has almost no independent standing to challenge it. I need you to sit with that before we go one step further, Because I am not going to sell you an easy fight, and I'm not going to let you walk in thinking the law is automatically on your side. It isn't, so there's nothing I can do. There is exactly one door, she said, already writing something on a legal pad. If your father retains the capacity to express a genuine preference about his own care and his own visitors, that matters enormously, regardless of what the guardianship paperwork says on its face. Capacity is not all or nothing under Missouri law. A person can be impaired in significant ways and still be legally entitled to be heard on specific questions. She looked up. I'm going to file for the archived visitor logs from both facilities today. Let's find out what he's actually been able to communicate, on paper, for 12 years, before anyone decided it didn't matter. What does this cost? I asked, because I needed to know the shape of the fight in every sense, not just the legal one. $220 an hour, and I'm not going to pretend that's cheap on a sergeant's pay, she said. I'll tell you now that most families in your position don't proceed past this meeting, not because they don't love the person, but because they run the math and decide the odds aren't worth it. I'm telling you the odds honestly. They are not good. They are not zero either, which is more than I can say for most of what walks through that door. She tapped the folder. The margin of difference in a case like this is usually paper. Whoever has more of it, and better dates on it, generally wins. So before anything else, I want every guest book you can get your hands on. And I want you to write down, today while it's fresh, the exact wording your mother used on the phone. Word for word. Memory degrades. Paper doesn't. I gave her what I had. She wrote for a long time without looking up, and when she finally did, her voice had softened by exactly 1 degree, which, for Rosalind Pike, was the equivalent of another woman weeping. I've done this work for 19 years, she said. The cases that actually turn are never the ones with the loudest villain. They're the ones where somebody quiet kept records they didn't know were evidence yet. Go find out who around your father has been keeping records. The banker's box arrived 3 weeks later, and Pike let me go through it myself, sitting cross-legged on the floor of her conference room, because she said I'd recognize my own handwriting faster than any paralegal on her staff would. I found it in the second volume, and then the third, and the fourth. My own signature, changing shape across a full decade, rounder and looser in the earliest years, then more compressed and efficient as deployments piled up, then finally the fast diagonal slash I write now, after 10 years of signing flight manifests at 3 in the morning with cold hands. 31 entries total, spread across every book in the box, every single one of them with that column, resident notificative visit, sitting completely empty. In the 2019 volume, tucked into the margin beside one of my own signatures, someone had written a note in handwriting that wasn't mine and didn't match any staff initials I recognized from the desk logs. Daughter here again, per Mrs. B. Do not inform resident. I read it 4 times before it settled. Then I checked the date, April the 9th. Fired. I remembered that particular visit clearly because I had flown home on emergency leave for it, squeezed between 2 deployments, and I had stood at that front desk and been told my father was having a difficult day, and it was best not to disturb him. I had been 18 feet away from him. There was a written note documenting exactly that, sitting in a facility file, for 4 years, and nobody had ever needed to show it to me before because nobody had ever needed to explain themselves to me before. I sat with that margin note a long time before I understood what actually unsettled me about it. It wasn't the instruction itself, it was the handwriting. Someone other than my mother had known, in writing, for 4 years, and had simply done as they were told. I remember thinking, sitting on that floor, that a note in a margin was surely the worst thing this family had managed to hide from me. I had no idea yet how small that note was going to look next to what was still coming. I sat on that floor for a long time after she said it, surrounded by 12 years of my own handwriting, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel in that moment, which was a strange, specific grief for the version of myself who had signed those books believing every signature counted as a visit. 23-year-old me, signing in loose rounded letters before her first deployment, had no idea she was building a paper trail she'd need 16 years later just to prove she'd existed in that hallway at all. I wanted, absurdly, to go back and tell her to write something else in the margin herself. A date, a time, anything that couldn't later be erased by someone else's authority over the record. Pike read the margin note twice, set the book down carefully, The way you'd set down something that might still be live, and said the first thing all afternoon that wasn't a caution. Now, she said, we have something. I confronted my mother the following Saturday in her kitchen, and I want to be honest that I expected her either to fall apart or to lie outright, and she did neither. Wanda Bellamy has never once, in my entire recollection of her, lost her composure in front of another human being, and she did not lose it that day either. She made coffee. She let me finish talking without interrupting once. Then she explained herself, in full, calm paragraphs, without ever once raising her voice, and it was the single most unsettling conversation of my adult life, because nearly every sentence she said contained a real fragment of something true, wrapped around something that wasn't. Your father declines for days after your visits, she said, setting my mug down in front of me like this was any other Saturday. You blow through twice a year with a duffel bag and a plane ticket home, and then you leave, and the rest of us are the ones who manage what it costs him afterward. Betters. Somebody has had to make the hard decisions while you were off being important somewhere on the other side of the world. I have done that alone for 12 years, and I am not going to sit in my own kitchen and apologize to you for protecting him. Then why did you move him to Wickham House and not tell a single person? Because the doctors said a change of environment can be disorienting, and I didn't want it to become a whole family production, she said, without missing a beat. You would have made it a production, Marguerite. You make everything a production. You'd have flown home, taken 3 days of leave you don't have, made a scene at the front desk about how nobody told you, and none of it would have helped your father one bit. It would have helped you feel better about yourself. There's a difference, and I stopped being able to afford it a long time ago. He asked for me, every year, on his birthday. He asks for a lot of things, she said, and for the first time that afternoon something flickered behind her eyes that wasn't quite composure. He asks for your grandmother some days. He asks for the truck he sold in 2003. Wanting something doesn't mean it's good for him to have it. There's a difference between wanting a truck that's gone and wanting his own daughter, Mom. Is there? She said, not really as a question, and drank her coffee. And for a moment I understood something about her I had never let myself understand before. That somewhere along the way, in her own mind, she had stopped being able to tell the difference between managing him and owning him, and that the distinction had simply stopped mattering to her. The way a tool you use every day eventually stops feeling like a tool at all. For half a second, less than half a second, really, her rhythm broke. I watched it happen, the smallest catch, and then I watched her recover it completely, stand up, cross to a drawer by the sink, and return with a manila folder that she set on the table between us, like she was laying down a winning hand at cards. I don't have to explain myself to you, she said. Legally, I am the only person on this earth who gets to decide who sees your father and where he lives and under what conditions. You are not on that list. You have never once been on that list. Read it yourself if you don't believe me. I read it. She was right. Every word of the law on that page sat entirely on her side of the table. I drove out of Cass Hollow at dusk and past the house I grew up in, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I actually looked at the porch instead of just driving past it out of habit. And I noticed the fixture beside the front door was dark. My father used to leave that light burning all night long. Every single night, whenever any one of his 3 kids was anywhere on the road, deployed, driving home late from college, out past curfew with friends, so that whoever was coming back would see it from the turn onto Route 9 and know, before they even reached the driveway, that the house was still waiting up for them. My mother had disconnected it 12 years ago. I had never consciously registered that fact until that exact moment, sitting at a stop sign in the dark. I remembered one night in particular, the winter I was 17 and Rudy had wrapped his first car around a fence post 2 counties away. And Dad had driven out in the middle of the night to get him and hadn't called to say when they'd be back. I remembered coming downstairs at 2 in the morning and finding my mother asleep on the couch and the porch light burning steady too through the front window, and understanding, even then, that the light wasn't decoration. It was a promise my father made to anyone he loved who wasn't home yet. I sat at that stop sign a long time before I finally pulled forward. Pike did not go after the fortress directly. She went after the foundation it had been built on. Every guardianship, under Missouri law, rests on a legal finding of incapacity, and this entire guardianship rested on a 2-page affidavit signed by a Dr. Neville Trask, dated 4 years earlier, based on a single 20-minute clinical evaluation that had never once been reviewed or repeated since the day it was signed. I perform cognitive and physiological assessments as part of my own job, on patients considerably less stable than my father, and I read that affidavit twice and recognized instantly the difference between an actual evaluation and a form completed quickly to close out a file before lunch. Pike petitioned the court for an independent, court-ordered capacity evaluation. Wanda's attorney opposed the motion with a level of aggression that told Pike, and eventually told me, more than the motion itself ever could have. The evaluation took place at Wickham House over 2 separate sessions, and the findings, when they came back, were careful, unglamorous, and entirely honest. My father had genuine vascular cognitive impairment. He had bad days and would continue to have them, and no court in the country was ever going to hand him back control of his own finances, and Pike never once pretended otherwise to me. But he was oriented to person, time, and place. He recognized faces reliably. And critically, on the official record, he retained the capacity to express a clear and internally consistent preference about his own care and his own visitors. The evaluator, a soft-spoken geriatric specialist named Dr. Adelaide Furr, spent the better part of the first sessions simply talking with him about the co-op, about line work, about the winter of the big ice storm in 1987 when half the county lost power for 9 days and he'd slept in his truck rather than come home, because the town needed him closer to the lines than to his own bed. He remembered all of it in order, with dates. It was only in the session that she moved carefully toward the actual questions the court needed answered. She asked him, formally on the record, whether there was anyone in particular he wished to see. He gave one name. She asked whether anyone had ever prevented that from happening. He said he didn't know. Nobody, he said, had ever told him there was anything to prevent. Dr. Furr's written findings, when Pike read them aloud to me afterward, included one line I have not been able to stop turning over since. The patient demonstrates impaired executive function consistent with vascular changes, but demonstrates no impairment whatsoever in his capacity to identify who he loves and to state, clearly and consistently across 2 separate sessions conducted 11 days apart, that he wishes to see her. Whatever has kept them apart is not a function of his cognition. Reading that transcript in Pike's office, I let myself feel, for the first time in months, something close to relief. He'd said her name into an official record. Surely, I thought, that would be enough on its own to settle the rest. It was not enough. It was, as it turned out, only the opening argument. 48 hours after Pike filed that evaluation with the court, the full conservatorship accounting arrived in discovery. 214 pages of bank statements, invoices, and disbursement records, and I read every single one of them the exact way I read a monitor on a patient who's crashing, hunting for the one number that would explain all the others. The Cass Hollow house, the one with the porch light, had sold 2 years earlier for $11,000 under its county-assessed value to a limited liability company that traced, 3 pages later in the paperwork, directly back to my sister Charlotte's husband. My father's pension and his VA disability compensation had both been redirected into a joint account that also disbursed, every single month, a line item labeled caregiver compensation to my mother, and separately in a smaller sum to Charlotte. There was a new vehicle in there, a new roof on Charlotte's house, itemized down to the shingles. A cruise, booked, canceled, and quietly rebooked 11 months later under a different confirmation number. And then the number that detonated everything else in that stack. The transfer from Ridgeline Manor to Wickham House carried no physician's order, no updated care plan, no medical justification of any kind anywhere in the file. None. Ridgeline had simply cost $2,900 a month more than Wickham House. And that exact difference had started appearing, the very next month, as an increase in the caregiver compensation line. They had moved a 71-year-old man out of the only facility he had lived in for 6 consecutive years, away from every single aide and nurse who actually knew his habits and his history, because he was cheaper somewhere worse. There was a smaller entry, easy to miss among the larger figures, that somehow bothered me more than any of them. $41 a month, recurring, labeled miscellaneous resident comfort items, paid to my mother directly, for a man who by then owned nothing that hadn't been assigned to him by a facility inventory list. I thought about the blanket that wasn't his. I thought about the reading glasses that weren't his either, the ones the court clerk had to lend him. $41 a month, for over a year, for comfort items that had apparently never once reached him. I sat with my own 12 years of allotment statements that night, laid out across my kitchen table under the one working overhead bulb, and understood, for the very first time in my adult life, exactly where all of that money had actually gone. I had sent an average of $310 a month for over a decade, believing every cent of it bought my father something: comfort, dignity, a better room, an extra aid on a hard day. Cross-referenced against the account ledger, I couldn't find a single line item it had touched that wasn't also touching my mother's. I thought about every deployment where I'd converted my per diem into that transfer instead of something for myself, telling myself it was the least I could do from 4,000 miles away. I thought about the year I'd skipped a dental procedure I actually needed because the allotment felt more urgent. None of that regret was really about the money, in the end. It was about the 12 years I had spent believing that distance was the only thing standing between my father and me, when the truth was that distance had never been the obstacle at all. The obstacle had a name and a return address in Cass Hollow, and it had been standing directly in front of me at every single Thanksgiving. Marlene Kolb from Adult Protective Services opened a formal investigation the following week, and she told me plainly, without softening a single word of it, what usually happens next in cases like this one. People like your mother don't fold once they've been caught, she said, across a folding table in a county office that smelled like burnt toner. They escalate. I've worked this job for 11 years. Fold. Whatever she does next, it will be aimed squarely at you, not at the evidence, because the evidence is the one thing she genuinely cannot argue with anymore. 9 days later, I was served with paperwork at my own duty station, in front of 2 junior airmen who had no idea what they were watching. Wanda's petition asked the court to formally restrict me as a disruptive and unsafe visitor, and the sworn declaration supporting it used the one part of my entire life my mother had never once acknowledged, praised, or even faced a single question about across 12 years: my service. It alleged, in a filed legal document bearing her signature, that I suffered from untreated combat-related stress, that I was volatile and unpredictable in my behavior, and that my presence actively destabilized a fragile elderly man. It attached nothing whatsoever in the way of medical evidence, only her own sworn word, a corroborating statement from Charlotte, and a 2-line letter from Dr. Trask that took him, by my count, roughly 90 seconds to write. The court, acting the way courts are trained to act whenever a vulnerable adult might conceivably be at risk, granted a temporary restraining order pending a full hearing. 12 consecutive years of decorations. Thousands of patients moved safely across oceans without losing a single one on my watch. And I was now, by an actual court order with my name typed on it, legally barred from coming within 100 feet of my own father. The filing reached my chain of command as a matter of official record, because it named my military service directly and by rank. Sturgis called me into his office, and he did not, for one single second, doubt me. I want that stated plainly. But he was required to document the allegation regardless of what he personally believed, and watching him write it down in his own careful handwriting was its own particular kind of humiliation. For the record, Sergeant, and only for the record, he said, sliding the form across the desk for me to read before he filed it. I have reviewed your fitness reports for 4 years. There is no combat stress designation anywhere in your file, treated or otherwise. I want you to see exactly what I'm required to write down. And I want you to understand that requiring it does not mean I believe a word of it. I understand, sir. I don't think you do entirely, he said, but you will. He signed the form, closed the folder, and looked up at me with something that, on a less disciplined face, might have passed for anger on my behalf. Go win your case, Sergeant. That's the only part of this that's actually yours to fix. Both of us understood the allegation was baseless. Neither of us could make that matter to the paperwork sitting between us. The isolation that followed wasn't dramatic in any way you could put in a film. It was just quiet. My apartment mostly. A phone that stopped ringing. I called Rudy on a Sunday because I still foolishly believed there was some version of my brother who would show up if I asked him plainly. He answered on the fourth ring, and I could hear a ball game playing behind him, turned up loud enough to give him somewhere to look that wasn't the conversation. "I don't want to be in the middle of it, Margot," he said. "You and Mom have always been like this. I've got my own stuff going on. He's our father, Rudy, not just mine, I know that." A long pause, the crowd noise swelling behind him. "I just don't want to pick a side. There isn't a side. There's a guest book with my signature in it and an empty box next to it that says, 'He was never told I came.' That's not a side, that's a fact." He didn't have an answer for that, so he told me he had to go, and the line went dead before the inning ended. I have since learned that a sentence like "I don't want to be in the middle of it" means exactly what it sounds like it means, and nothing more generous than that. Charlotte, for her part, blocked my number outright on every device she owns, as far as I have ever been able to tell. I drove out to Wickham House anyway, on a Thursday afternoon, and parked 40 feet from the window where I knew he sat most days, and I did not get out of the truck, because getting out would have proven my mother's filing correct, in exactly the way she wanted it proven. And I was not going to hand her that victory, even from 100 feet away, where no one could see me refuse it. I sat there long enough that the light through the windshield changed twice, first the flat gray of an overcast afternoon, and then the deeper gold that comes right before a Missouri sky starts turning orange, and I thought, not for the first time that month, about how strange it was that the law which was supposed to protect my father from harm was the exact same law, currently keeping me from proving I wasn't one. I was still sitting there, engine off, hands on the wheel, when a car pulled into the space beside mine, and the woman who climbed out of it was 74 years old and holding a spiral notebook against her chest like it might blow away in a wind that wasn't blowing. Gwen Halstead had been my mother's friend for 30 years, and, without ever once meaning to be, her broadcast system for 12 of them. She told me later that the driveway was what finally did it for her. That she had spent 20 minutes that March afternoon genuinely, sincerely believing I was dead, and that in the middle of those 20 minutes she had said something out loud to a neighbor over the fence that she had not been able to stop hearing in her own voice and words. Well, that poor woman. And after everything with that daughter of hers, I went home that night and asked myself where exactly I'd gotten that particular thought, she said, standing by my open truck window with the afternoon light going gold behind her. And I realized I'd been saying some version of it, out loud, to other people for years without ever once questioning where it had come from. So I went home and found these instead. She kept the minutes for her church women's circle, had kept them faithfully since 2009, one small spiral notebook per calendar year, dated and handwritten in her own careful hand, because nobody else in the group had ever wanted the job. She set the entire stack, 11 notebooks deep, on the hood of my truck. Year after year, in her looping cursive, sat the exact things my mother had told a room full of women who trusted her completely and had no reason not to. That Margot never called. That Margot wouldn't come home, even when specifically asked. That Margot had told the facility personally not to bother contacting her. That Margot sent money instead of ever showing up in person, as though a check could stand in for a daughter. That Merle asked for her by name, and it broke Wanda's heart every single time to have to invent another excuse. "I owe you an apology I don't know how to give properly," Gwen said. Still standing at my window, the notebooks balanced against her chest. "I've known your mother 30 years. I sat next to her at your father's own mother's funeral. I have said unkind things about you to people who never met you, based on nothing but her word because I loved her and I had no reason on this earth to doubt her. I want you to know I'm not doing this to hurt her. I'm doing it because I finally asked myself a very simple question, and I couldn't live with the answer I gave myself." What was the question? Whether I would want someone to do this for me, if it were my daughter standing in a parking lot not able to get out of her own truck. She set the notebooks down on the hood, careful with them the way you'd be careful with something borrowed. "I don't know if any of this is worth a thing legally. I'm not a lawyer. I just know it's true, and I know where I wrote it down." I laid the notebooks out on the tailgate beside the guest book dates I already had memorized by then. They lined up perfectly. On dates when my own actual handwriting sat in a book 11 miles away, My mother stood in a church basement and told a room full of people that her daughter had never once come. Pike called it corroborated pattern evidence and filed an emergency motion to vacate the visitation restriction that same evening, before I'd even made it back to base. The hearing was set 11 days out. Those 11 days were, in some ways, harder than everything that came before them, because for the first time since March I had nothing left to do but wait. I flew 2 rotations during that stretch, both routine, both uneventful, and I remember being grateful for the routine of them in a way I never had been before. Grateful for a job that gave my hands something exact to do while the rest of my life sat suspended in a filing cabinet 2 counties away. I checked my phone obsessively between legs of the flight, the way families of my own patients check monitors, looking for a change that either confirms the worst or finally lets you breathe. And my father, told about all of it by a nurse's aide who thought, correctly, that he'd want to know, asked to be brought. Pike warned me, more than once, in increasingly specific language, not to coach him, not to rehearse a single line with him ahead of time. Not only because it would look bad to a judge, although it would, but because if he sounded prepared, he would sound coached, and the entire case now depended on him sounding exactly like what he actually was, an old man telling the plain truth as he understood it. So instead, I did something considerably harder than preparing him. Under limited supervised visitation, with the restrictions still partly in force, I sat with him and told him the entire truth of it. The affidavit, the transfer, the money, the church notebooks, the guest books. I did not ask him for a single thing at the end of it. He didn't follow every piece of it. He lost the thread once, in the middle, and asked me to start again from the part about the light bill. But he asked me to repeat one number twice, carefully, like he was memorizing it for later. 31. Then he asked whether he could see the book himself, in person, with his own hands. You don't have to go, Dad, I told him. Pike can present all of this without you in that room at all. Nobody expects it of you. I didn't ask what was expected of me, he said, and there was an edge in it I recognized from childhood, the same that had sent him out the door in ice storms while other linemen called in sick. I asked whether I could see the book. I'd like to hold it myself, in that room, in front of her, so there's no version of this she gets to tell people afterward that isn't true. I've had enough versions of things told about me that weren't true. It'll be hard. You understand that. I climbed poles in February for 38 years, Maggie. I know what hard is. He looked at me steadily. This is easier than that. This is just telling the truth out loud. In a room where somebody finally has to listen. And then Merle Bellamy, a man who had spent 38 years climbing utility poles in ice storms so that other people's houses would have power when his own family sometimes went without it, said he wanted to go to the courthouse. And he said it in the exact voice he used to use at 4 in the morning when a line was down somewhere, and somebody had to go out and fix it before the whole town woke up cold. Before I left the facility that day, he asked me one more question, quietly, and it reframed the entire shape of everything that had happened to us. Did she tell me you were dead? I owed him the truth, even in the worst moment of both our lives. No, Dad, I said. She told you I didn't call. He was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at nothing in particular. That was worse, he said finally, and I had no argument to offer him, because he was entirely right. The courtroom was small, fluorescent lit, and held about 22 people on hard wooden benches, and the evidence went in mostly through other voices, not mine. The independent capacity evaluation, the 214-page accounting, Sandra Kell's records finally released under subpoena, Gwen Halstead's 11 church notebooks, the 2019 margin note blown up and projected on a screen for the entire room to read for themselves. Sandra Kell testified exactly the way I'd expected her to. Flatly and without embellishment, confirming under oath that Ridgeline Manor had no record of any physician recommending my father's transfer, that facility protocol required such a recommendation for any resident relocation, and that none existed in his file. She was not a friendly witness for either side. She was simply accurate, which turned out to matter more than warmth ever could have. Marlene Kolb testified for Adult Protective Services in flat, careful sentences, walking the judge through the timeline of her investigation, the caregiver compensation payments, and the absence of any medical paperwork justifying the facility change. She did not editorialize once. She didn't need to. The dates did the work by themselves. Charlotte, already cooperating quietly with the prosecutor's office by then, was conspicuously not in the room, and her absence was, in its own way, its own piece of testimony. My mother testified for 11 minutes, and I will admit even now that she was very good at it. Composed, wounded in exactly the right places, at exactly the right moments. She told the court in a steady voice that everything she had done had come from love, that a daughter who visits twice a year does not understand what daily caregiving actually costs a person, that she had never once denied her husband anything he genuinely needed. She was reasonable sounding on every single point except one, and Pike waited, patient as stone, for that one question to come around. Why was there no physician's order authorizing the transfer to Wickham House? I made a judgment call, Wanda said, as his guardian. That is what the role permits. A judgment call that happened to save your household $2,900 a month, Pike said, not raising her voice at all. Paid out, the following month, as an increase in your own compensation. Is that also what the role permits, Mrs. Bellamy? Wanda did not have an answer for that. It was the only true silence of her entire testimony, and everyone in that small room heard it land, including the court reporter, who paused for half a second before her fingers moved again. Then my father was brought in. The judge asked him whether he understood where he currently was. He did, clearly and without hesitation. She asked him whether he wished his wife to continue serving as his legal guardian. He didn't answer the question directly. Instead, he asked whether he might be permitted to see the book. The bailiff carried over the 2016 volume and handed it to him. And my father, 72 years old now, a cannula clipped under his nose, and a pair of reading glasses borrowed from the court clerk, because his own were still sitting on a nightstand 40 miles away, opened the cover and began reading my signatures out loud to the room. The date. The time. The date. The time. He made it through 9 separate entries, his voice slow but entirely steady, before the judge leaned forward from the bench and very gently asked him if he would stop there. He stopped. Then he looked across 10 feet of courtroom at the woman he had been married to for 44 years and said the only sentence he spoke directly to her during the entire proceeding. Wanda, I would have wanted to know. Nobody in the gallery moved for a long moment after the judge finished speaking. I remember the specific sound of the room in that silence. A radiator ticking somewhere, behind the bench. Someone's chair creaking as they shifted their weight. The bailiff quietly collecting the 2016 volume from my father's hands and setting it back on the evidence table with a care that felt, for just a second, like its own small act of respect. My father reached over and took my hand while we waited for the judge to finish reading the formal order into the record. And neither of us said anything at all, because there was nothing left that needed saying out loud in that particular room. The guardianship was vacated from the bench that same afternoon. As the room slowly emptied out into the hallway, I watched Imogen Fairbanks, from the prosecutor's office, cross the aisle and quietly ask Rosalind Pike whether she happened to have 45 minutes free that week. She had considerably more than 45 minutes to spare, as it turned out, and so did the state. My mother was charged and months later, convicted on state counts of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, perjury by declaration in a filed court document, and breach of fiduciary duty as a court-appointed conservator. The trial itself lasted 4 days, most of it dry financial testimony from a forensic accountant walking the jury through the same 214 pages I'd already memorized line by line. She received a custodial sentence just short of 3 years, full restitution ordered against her share of the marital estate, a figure that, once the house sale was unwound and recalculated at fair value, came to just over $91,000, and a permanent bar from ever serving as a fiduciary for any person again in the state of Missouri. The church circle she had organized and led faithfully for 30 years asked her, quietly and without any public ceremony, not to come back. Nobody sent her a card. I know because I asked once, and nobody could think of anyone who had. Charlotte pleaded to reduced counts in exchange for her ongoing cooperation. She repaid in full every dollar of the caregiver compensation she had collected, was placed on probation, lost her administrative position at the clinic, and is now permanently barred from any role that grants access to patient medical records. Her husband's involvement in the undervalued house sale was separately unwound in civil court, dollar by dollar, and the two of them sold their own home within the year to cover what the settlement required. I have not spoken to Charlotte since the day of the verdict. She sent me one message afterward, 3 words long. That said only "I'm sorry, Margot, and I have never decided what I think was actually apologizing for. Dr. Neville Trask was disciplined by the state medical board for issuing a formal capacity affidavit without conducting an adequate examination, and he now practices, when he practices at all, under a set of public restrictions attached permanently to his license. The board's public order noted, in language considerably drier than the facts deserved, that a 20-minute evaluation conducted 4 years prior to a guardianship proceeding does not, on its own, constitute an adequate basis for a finding that would remove a person's fundamental rights indefinitely. Rudy faced absolutely nothing. No criminal charges, no civil suit, no formal finding against his name anywhere in any record. He simply became, over time, a man that nobody left in what remains of our family calls anymore. And I have come to understand that the particular silence surrounding his phone is a sentence in itself, one that nobody in a courtroom ever had to hand down out loud. My father's guardianship was replaced with a far more limited arrangement, one that explicitly preserves his own right to choose his own visitors from this point forward. The restitution ordered against my mother's estate now funds the entirety of his care. The sentencing hearing, Fairbanks asked me whether I wanted to read a victim impact statement into the record. I told her, honestly, that I didn't want to write one for myself. I read my father's instead. 3 sentences long, which he had dictated to me slowly over the course of 2 separate afternoons at Wickham House, and which I copied down exactly as he spoke them, without changing a single word of his own language. I worked 38 years so my family would never sit in the dark. I read, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. I did not know until this year that I had been sitting in it myself. I would like the rest of whatever time I have left to be spent with the people who were looking for me the whole time. Nobody in that courtroom said anything for a moment after I finished. Even the court reporter's hands stayed still. Given every possible chance, in that final hearing, to simply say she had been wrong, my mother could not do it. She stood at her own allocution and told the courtroom that she had held this family together for 40 years, while everyone else, one by one, had left. And she said it with total, unshaken conviction, the same conviction she'd used in her own kitchen months earlier. Sitting there listening to her, I finally understood that she was never, in this lifetime, going to hand me an apology, and that I was simply going to have to learn how to be all right without one. 6 weeks after the sentencing, an envelope arrived at my apartment with a return address in Southern Illinois, and inside it was an invitation with a printed date on it. The following year's dinner fell exactly 13 months after a colonel first knocked on a door in Cass Hollow, Missouri, carrying nothing more dangerous than a cream-colored envelope. The hall was the same one it always was, a base community center with government-issued and a stage that had hosted everything from retirement ceremonies to the annual children's holiday party, strung that night with the same modest bunting as every year before it. In the front row, on the aisle where the wheelchair access ramp led, sat a 72-year-old man with an oxygen line clipped neatly under his nose, wearing a vest he had personally picked out at a men's shop near the base and would not be talked out of, no matter how many times I quietly offered him the plainer navy one instead. It was a deep hunter green, with brass buttons he polished himself the morning of the dinner, sitting at the kitchen table with a cloth and a tin of polish he'd had me buy specially, because, he said, a man ought to look like he meant to be somewhere. Beside him sat one empty chair, and nobody at that entire table said a single word about it, then or later. Colonel Sturgis read the citation exactly as dry as he had been the first day he told me about 11 casualty notifications for sustained and distinguished performance in aeromedical evacuation across 12 consecutive years, during which Senior Master Sergeant Bellamy transported patients across 3 theaters of operation without a single loss in transit. He read, in the same even register he used for weather briefings, and somehow, delivered in that same flat register, it landed harder than any warmer speech ever could have. He did not glance at my father in the front row, and he did not need to. Everyone in that hall understood exactly who the empty chair had belonged to for 12 years, and exactly who had finally filled the one beside it instead. When they invited me up to speak, I talked for about 90 seconds and did not say one single sentence about myself. I talked instead about what it actually means to be the person strapped in at the back of a cargo aircraft whose entire job for Rengche has been making absolutely certain that someone gets home safely to the people who already know they're coming. I said that the job had taught me that arriving is only half of it, that somebody also has to be waiting, and know they're waiting, for the arrival to mean anything at all. I looked at my father in the front row when I said it, and he nodded once, the way he used to nod at a line crew when a repair had finally held. If you've ever wondered what it truly costs a family, when the people who are supposed to protect you decide that silence is simply easier than the truth, there is another story exactly like this one waiting for you right now. That night, I drove my father back to the small one-story rental house I'd found for him near the base. No steps anywhere, a ramp nobody had to fight a single person to have installed. The drive back took 40 minutes, and for most of it he sat quietly with his window cracked, watching the fields go by in the dark, the way he used to watch line routes from a bucket truck. Somewhere around the halfway point he asked me whether I still had the electrical tape story straight, and I told him I did, every word of it. And he seemed satisfied enough with that to close his eyes for the rest of the ride. Before we went inside, he stopped on the front and looked up at the light fixture beside the door, freshly rewired the week before, and asked me, quietly, whether I remembered why he used to leave it burning. I told him that I did. He used to leave it on all night, every single night, whenever any one of his kids was anywhere out on the road, so that whoever was finally coming home would see it from the turn, and know, before they even reached the driveway, that the house was still waiting up for them. Leave it on tonight, he said. I'll leave it on every night, I told him. That's not necessary, he said. I know, I said. He let that sit a moment, then patted my arm once, the same brisk two-pat gesture he used to give a repair once he'd tested it and trusted it to hold, and went inside ahead of me, leaving me alone on the walk for a minute with the light already burning steady above the door. I used to believe that 12 years of empty chairs at that dinner were the worst part of all of this. The applause with no one in the room who actually mattered to hear it land. I understand now that the applause was never the thing I was actually missing. What I wanted, this entire time, was something far simpler and far harder to fake. One single person who believed I deserved to be told the truth. A person can take your house, your pension, even the years you had left with the people who loved you, and none of that is the cruelest theft available to them. The cruelest theft is quieter than any of that. It is letting someone live out the last chapter of their life without ever once telling them they were still loved the whole way through it. My father still asks me, some nights when the fog rolls in a little heavier than usual, whether I've come far to see him, and I tell him the truth every single time, because that is the only debt I owe either of us now. Not affection, which was never actually in question, but honesty, plain and unadorned, delivered the moment it's asked for and not one day later. Dignity was never going to be handed to either one of us from a podium. It turned out, in the end, to be nothing more complicated than a light left burning by someone who never once stopped believing we were still coming home.